Know that we have great speakers here, and tonight is absolutely no exception. We're speaking live from the East Room at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, where we have a full house to hear Dana Perino. Now, not introducing her yet. Now, she was President Bush's press secretary for several years. You've seen her on Fox. She's a Fox contributor. Her book is #1 in the New York Times today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dana Perino. We're doing a little different format tonight. We've done this before. Those of you who come frequently know that we do In Conversation With, and tonight is In Conversation with Dana Perino. Now, doing that is Rick, who has been with her for years. He is a spokesman for years for the United Nations. President Bush named him the Director of Communications when he was president at the United Nations, where he remained for 7 or 8 years. He then was Romney's National Security Foreign Affairs spokesperson. He is a partner in his own firm now in Los Angeles, Capital Media, and he is with us tonight to interview the #1 bestseller, Dana Perino. Please welcome Rick Grenell, right there.
Thank
Rick
you.
Grenell. All yours.
Thank you. Wow, what a crowd. First of all, we have to say to Dana, welcome to California.
Thank you.
We have so much to talk about. This book is pretty exciting, I have to say, and I want to get right into it and ask as many questions as possible. I want to start off by saying this is graduation season. And I don't know how you feel, Dana, but this book, to me, is the perfect book to buy
Absolutely.
for a graduate. It's filled with really good positive messages about you can do anything. So as we get into this, I really hope that you can share with us. This is an intimate setting. Let's get really intimate.
With all my closest friends.
We want you to open up. So let's start with, I think, one issue that really became a serious game changer in the Bush White House, which was September 11th, that terrible day. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were, what your feelings were like, and any interaction you had with the White House?
I have been on book tour for 3 weeks and not had that question, but it probably is the most important question because it changed all of our lives. It changed the presidency. It changed the world. And I actually was in San Diego, California. I had worked on Capitol Hill way back when, in 1995 is when I started there. I thought I was going to be a journalist, and I ended up going to Washington instead. And worked there on Capitol Hill, and then one day I meet this guy on an airplane, and I heard this British accent, thought he was kind of handsome, and did the quick, women can do that quick scan, no wedding ring. So I did a little bit of that, and then he turned out to be very funny, and anyway, I moved to England, and I married him, and that was 18 years ago. But we lived in England for about 10 months together, and frankly, socialism and rain did not suit me very well. And he wanted to start a business, and so we decided we would come back to America and we could live anywhere we wanted, and we chose to be in San Diego. And we moved there with nothing, except for the 6-month-old Hungarian Vizsla puppy named Henry. He was a predecessor of Jasper, your favorite. And I worked in PR firms, and actually my first job in San Diego was at the city council for one of the city councilmen, and Rick Grinnell was the spokesperson for the mayor, Susan Golding. So we have quite a history going back, and then we worked together in the Bush administration and now for Fox News, so you're stuck with me.
Yeah.
So I'm working for the PR firms, and I get a call in 2000 from Mindy Tucker, who plays a role in my life a couple of different times. And she calls and says, hey, Dana, we're down here in Texas, the Bush campaign, and we're wondering, would you be willing to be a spokesperson for us in California? We can't afford to pay you anything, but, it's very prestigious. And I wanted to do it so badly, but I was the only one in our relationship that had a job with benefits at the time, and so I had to say no. And I remember hanging up the phone, and I cried, and I said, now I'll never get to work for George Bush. A couple of years go by, and I write about in the book just being a little bored, and I felt like I was not doing what I was supposed to be doing. That feeling of you thinking, it just wasn't right. And so in August of 2001, my husband did something called the whiteboard incident. So he gets the whiteboard out, and he sits me down, and he says, okay, list everything you want to do in a job. List everything you don't want to do in a job. So I did that. And then he's a business background, so he made me assign a numerical value to each one. And he said, obviously, you need to be in Washington, D.C. So I called this woman, Mindy Tucker, again, and I said, look, I know the jobs are filled. She was then at the Justice Department for Attorney General Ashcroft. But I said, I'd like to come back, and if you hear of anything, let me know. And I booked a ticket to go and do some informational interviews for the week of September 17th. And so 9/11 happens. And my husband always brings me my English breakfast tea in the morning, and then he took the dog out, and I walked into the living room, and I said, oh my gosh, it looks like the World Trade Center is on fire. And then right then I saw the second plane hit. And 3 days later, Mindy called me, and she said, I know you said you'd be willing to come back to Washington, but would you still consider that after all that's happened? And if you would you come and be a spokesperson at the Justice Department? And I remember being on the phone, and I was packing my bag. I was like, I'm out. And I never went back to San Diego. As much as I loved it, and actually, there was one time I did go back years and years later, and I thought, why did I ever leave here? It's so beautiful. But one of the things about September 11th that when I first got to the White House, I had to wait for my clearance. So one of the things I had to do was children's mail. And just as I was waiting for the Justice Department to clear me, and I remember getting all of these letters from school groups all across the country, praying for the president, apologies to the nation, and also the occasional, could you come to my birthday party? Children's mail is the best job at the White House. But the president gave a speech right after 9/11 where he said, we will not tire, we will not falter, we will not fail. Peace and freedom will prevail. And he, I printed that out, and I had it on my desk that 7.5 years, because it spoke to me and of that moment. And I will tell you that no matter what we were doing, if we were doing, the Little League baseball team, or we were visiting the Boy Scouts, or off doing an energy event, I could always tell in his eyes, in the back of his mind, he's thinking, are we doing everything we can to make sure that never happened again? And he's still, I think, obviously the burden is lighter when you're not in the presidency anymore, but if I could just finish this with one story of how my time in the White House ended, and it's just this great bookend, and I opened chapter 1 with it. The last weekend before we turn over the White House to the Obama administration, George H.W. Bush was being honored when his ship was being commissioned, the aircraft carrier. So we all go to Norfolk, Virginia. I am sure there are people in this room who were probably there because everybody was there. And it was this really cold day, but blue sky, and I was just trying to soak up the moment because it was my last chance to be on Air Force One and Marine One, and it's this historic moment because you had father and son, which we would probably never see in our lifetime again. We might see mother and daughter, come to think of it, but father and son we're not going to see again. And I get a tap on my shoulder from a Secret Service agent, and he whispers in my ear, "The president needs you at the helicopter in 10 minutes. I thought, okay. And I didn't want to make any sudden movement because when you're press secretary, the reporters watch your every move. So I just played it cool for a second, but inside I was very nervous because we know from experience that terrorists try to strike in times of transition. So I just played it cool, went through the ship out to the helicopter, and Condi's there, Condi Rice, and Fred Fielding, a couple of others, and I didn't know what was going on. So I just get on the helicopter, and the president bounds aboard, and he says, "Let's go see the SEALs." And it was his idea to go and visit as a surprise the Navy SEALs training center that was nearby, about 20-minute helicopter ride. So we arrive, and they didn't know he was coming. It was a huge hangar, like maybe 2 hangars full, and there's all of these amazing young American men in their suits listening to Dick Cheney give a speech. All of them had really long beards, okay? The president gave remarks, just off the cuff, full of emotion, and he ends, and he's got tears in his eyes, and the Marines, the SEALs, they will not stop clapping. And I say that it was an order they did not have to obey. But he's going to take pictures with everybody, and so I made my way to the back of the room like a good staffer does to get out of the way. And these 2 SEALs came up to me and they said, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you the press secretary?" Wow, they even know who I am. That's amazing. So I just wanted to make some small talk because they want to get their picture with me. So I asked 2 questions. And the first SEAL, I said, "What made you want to become a Navy SEAL? Sense of adventure, family tradition, chance to see the world, physical challenge, what was it?" And the first SEAL says to me, "Oh no, ma'am, chicks dig it."
True.
It's true.
It's true.
And I said, "Even with the beard?" And he said, "Yeah, they get it." So the second SEAL, I said, when you're preparing to go wherever it is you may be going, do you have to take a lot of language classes? And he says, "Oh no, ma'am, we're really not there to talk."
That's great.
And I tell that story to bookend your question because we get on the chopper to head back, and it's my last flight on Marine One with the president, and he said, "That was cool." I said, "Yeah, it was great." And I tell him the story, and he threw back his head and he laughed. He said, "God, I love those guys." And they understood the mission. They understood freedom and what we were fighting for. And if all the things, I got to see him last week, of all the things that come with the presidency, the only thing he misses is being commander-in-chief.
For those of you who don't know, there is also a ugly side to working at the White House. Long hours, incredible stress. And I think this book does a great job of telling the wonderful stories about what it's like to be working so closely with the president, but it also gives a sense of how tough it is. And there are moments, I think, that all political staffers go through where they question what they're doing. The day that you became White House press secretary was also a day that you maybe had had enough.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
The day I got the job to be White House press secretary was the day I walked into the White House fully intending to resign. And a theme throughout the book is that every time I made a plan, God had a different idea, and it turned out to be better than the one I had. That story is amazing. You know, Ed Gillespie was the director of communications at the White House, and he's done also so much in his life. And he also recently ran for Senate in Virginia and came this close to winning, and he really should have won that seat. Well, he was the director of communications, and one of the things that, it was around this time of the presidency that the Obama administration is facing right now, which is about 18 months to go. You've had people that have been there since the campaign, and as a staffer, you do get tired. And one of the things I write about is very openly, and for the first time, is some of the health challenges that I ended up with, mostly because I didn't take care of myself. And if I had to do anything over again, it would have been that. But Josh Bolton, the chief of staff, had said to us, if you don't think that you can make it until the end of the administration, you should probably think about leaving now because the president intends to sprint to the finish. And I had to be honest that I was barely crawling. My husband and I went on a trip. He was running this hood to coast race, which is this really crazy idea of running in the middle of the night through the woods with a bunch of people, which I wasn't going to do, but I went with him and I had a day off. And on the way there and back, I said, we really should talk about this. And the family members of White House senior staffers go through a lot as well. And he was quiet about it, though. One of my favorite pieces of advice in the book is that choosing to be loved is not a career-limiting decision. At least it doesn't have to be, and it wasn't for me. And he would support me whatever I wanted to do, and he knew how hard it would be for me to say that I wasn't going to get a chance to work for George Bush. Because once you leave the White House, it's very unlikely you're going back. But we decided I'm going to leave. And we make all these plans on the way home. I'm going to go to Target, and I was going to make breakfast twice a week. Of course, I have to have a plan, right? So I'm like, I'll make breakfast twice a week. I'll walk the dog Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You'll do this. We'll do this. We'll take this big road trip. And I get to the White House that morning, on Monday morning, and I think, I don't know how I'm going to tell the president, so I'm just going to have to rip this Band-Aid off. So we get to the morning meeting. Bush White House started very early. It was 7:30. And I see Ed Gillespie, the director of communications, and I said, hey, Ed, can I talk to you after this meeting? He said, yes, I need to talk to you too, so that'd be great. I said, fine. Meeting ends, and you know how if the leader of the meeting says, Dana, can you stay behind? Everyone thinks you're in trouble. At least that's what I always think, that I'm in trouble. So everybody files out, and I sit down, and I am ready to just blurt it out, and Ed says, do you mind if I go first? No, sure. And I sat back, and that's when he said, the president would like to make you the press secretary on Monday. And I said, oh, really? And I wasn't sure if I was just kind of the convenient choice, but I just remember thinking, what am I going to tell Peter?
Did you say yes before you called Peter?
Oh, yeah. And I went downstairs and I whisper into the phone and tell Peter, and he says, anything you need, I'll be there to help you. The president knew how hard it was on staff, and you know what he did? This is the president one of the things I wanted to do in this book is talk about the personal side of him, and as a manager, how he knew that I was fine, I could do the job. But it was Peter. I was gone 18 hours a day, and even when I was home, I wasn't really present. And I used to sneak my BlackBerry upstairs so I could email. Just so, I'll be right back. And then I go upstairs, like yelling at the New York Times, usually. And the president invited me and Peter to Camp David soon after that, and it was Peter's birthday. And Peter hadn't said to anybody that it was his birthday, but presidents know things. And out comes this big cake. And his biggest bragging right is that President Bush and Condi Rice sang him happy birthday.
Oh, that's great.
And that bought me another year and a half.
So many presidential staffers write books that are a little bit negative or telling us the gossipy side of what's going on in the White House. You wrote a very different book, and you peel back the curtain on a president that we know and we love because he teaches us lessons about life, and he has incredible character. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to tell some of these stories that have not been public.
When I left the White House, I worked on several other books. I did the PR and the book tour for Karl Rove, Laura Bush, President Bush, Charles Krauthammer, lots of other people, and I was asked by an initial publisher if I ever intended to write a book. And I said, oh, no. And they said, well, why not? And I said, well, and I had written on a piece of paper the idea for this book, and it was in my wallet. And I said, well, I guess, and I carried it around for like 2 years. I said, oh, I have this idea, and they looked at it and they said, oh, that'll never sell. I hope they're watching now. And that what they want, political books typically are books that are, they're going to take a jab at somebody. And I didn't have any bad things to say about anyone, nor would I have said anything like that. This book answers two basic questions for me. One is a one-stop shop where I can answer, how does somebody who grew up in Wyoming and Colorado with no political connections end up at age 35 the first Republican woman press secretary? And the second thing that it does is I really feel like it is the missing puzzle piece to a lot of the short-term history that has been written so far on the Bush administration. Because historians from now until the end of time will be able to look back at the public record and the policies and the politics and what everybody else has written about that time. But there were very few people who could write this book with a personal perspective of somebody who, I was the deputy for a long time. That's one of my pieces of advice. You always take the deputy job. You work holidays, weekends, nights, and whenever, but that's when you get to know the boss. When we used to call ourselves the B team. So we'd walk in on a Saturday like, hello, sir, the B team. And he used to say, that's the best team. So we had fun. And I really felt like I don't write about, well, then he decided to do the surge, and then we did this, and then we did that. It really is taking people behind the scenes of what it was like, what I call leadership from a follower's perspective. How he was more than a commander-in-chief to me and my boss. He really was like a second father to me. And I felt every blow on his behalf. And in this book, you will not find a negative word about George Bush. And I was on the radio the other day in New York City, and somebody said, can you really say that George Bush was a good president? And I said, I can and I do. And he did reteach me a few of life's lessons. And one of my predecessors had written a book that was quite negative. He knew I was upset about it. He called me into the Oval Office at 6:40 in the morning. And he was writing personal letters of correspondence to families of the fallen. That's what he did between 6:30 and 7 in the morning. So here he calls me in because he hears I'm upset about this stupid book. My problems are about this big. And he says, I'd like you to try to forgive him. I said, and he said, no buts. I don't want you to live bitterly. No one's going to remember this book in 3 weeks, and I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to protect me. But trust me, I'm going to be fine. I said, yes, sir. Can I throw him under the bus first? And he said no. But the reason I love this story the most is because at the very end of that story is he knew me better than I was even admitting to myself with the reasons I was worried and upset about the book. So I'm walking out of the Oval, and just as I was about to cross the threshold, he says, hey, by the way, I don't think you'd ever do this to me. See, I know.
You know, we're watching something which I think is pretty amazing. Over the last several years, we've watched President Bush, 43, really take the high road with Barack Obama's presidency and all of the problems that we're having around the world. President Bush has really been very good about stepping back and saying this is not, my presidency. He's not critiquing. He did not have that same gift in 2008 when both sides, I think, predominantly from President Obama, but both sides were really throwing a lot of mud at him. And you were inside the White House watching this. One thing that the world does not know, how did President Bush handle that?
Well, better than I did. His instruction to us early on was, we are not getting involved in this campaign. So do not let yourself get dragged into it. It's very tempting. It's because the White House press corps will ask you every day, well, Hillary Clinton said this about Bush, and Obama said this, and then it was McCain, and all the rest of them said this about him. And I was pretty disciplined. One of the things I always did at the podium was imagine if the president were watching me, would he be proud? And if the answer was no, then I didn't say it. I just thought it. Just kidding. There was one time I did push back. I remember the question. I remember where I was. We were at the Crawford Middle School. I could see it right now. I see the reporter asking me the question about something Hillary Clinton had said in her primary fight against Obama.
Can you tell us the reporter's name?
No.
Can I guess?
No, it's not who you guess. It's somebody who keeps a lot of statistics. Okay.
Senator Nelson?
No.
Just a joke.
Inside joke. And I pushed back because I had the facts in my head. And 30 minutes later, the Hillary Clinton campaign had a big fundraising appeal out using my words against the president. So I thought, oh, shoot, I'm in trouble. So I just knew, I'm like, okay, that might have, the thing is, the president knew that felt good for 1 second. When you hit back, it feels good for just 1 second, and then you have to suffer the consequences. So I get a phone call, and it's from the president. He's at the ranch, and he says, hey, again, I know what you're trying to do for me, but you got to let it go, because the best thing you can do for John McCain is just stay out of it. And if he's going to push at me, that's fine, because look, I had to distance myself from my dad too. And Hillary Clinton has to distance herself from her husband, because everyone's got to be their own person when they run for office, and we just can't let ourselves get bogged down in it. And once he said that to me, it was quite freeing. But I do remember at the convention when President Bush didn't end up going to Minneapolis in 2008, and he gave a speech from the Cross Hall as this hurricane was forecasted to hit in southeastern United States. And he finishes, and the cameras are all set up, and we can see the monitors, and there's the live from the floor in Minneapolis. And this is kind of a vulnerable moment of weakness, I guess, in some ways, maybe on his part in a way. But I actually think it's just a human moment where he looked at me, and I write about this, and he said, do you think they know they're insulting me? Like, as a staffer and a friend, I never sugarcoated anything for him. So I just waited a beat, and then I looked up at him, and I said, yes, sir, I believe they do. But I remember that moment as being the time when I felt like I could just let it all go then, because it really didn't matter. He was right. He didn't worry so much about his legacy interviews the last 6 months as I was trying to scramble around, figure out who to talk to. And he said, I don't seek the Klieg lights. I'm not going to try to be that ex-president that comments on everything. The job is hard enough as it is. And he's comfortable not being in the spotlight. And he said that in 1 year, he read 3 books about George Washington. And if historians are still analyzing the first president, then the 43rd doesn't have a lot to worry about.
Dana was my boss when I was up at the UN, and so we ended up talking about foreign policy quite a bit. I'd love for you to kind of give us a little flavor on the Vladimir Putin story with when he asked about a reporter in the United States.
That's a good story. Actually, I haven't been asked about that yet. So this is in the book, but I'll give you a snapshot. It was 2005. I was junior Birdman deputy press secretary. I had just arrived on the scene, and one of our first trips was overseas. I think we were in Latvia for a NATO meeting or something. And there was going to be a bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin, and then they were going to have a joint press conference where you get 2 questions for the Russians and 2 questions for the Americans. And my job was to sit with our press corps and to be the eyes and ears and to be able to brief the White House Communications Director, Dan Bartlett, and the President and Vladimir Putin about what I thought the American press corps was going to ask. Putin already knew what the Russians were going to ask. Now that I think about it, no wonder I was the only one in there. So I actually feel like I was really good at knowing what the reporters were going to ask. Like, I could just pick up on things. I read their work. I could imitate them perfectly. And so I go in, I'm in position, and the president, honestly, he doesn't hardly know me. I'm new on the scene. But he was kind. And so he looks at me, and here I am. Here's Vladimir Putin. He has the coldest eyes in the world, and he says, 43 says, okay, what do you got? And I had been told by the communications director that no matter what, we knew that the American press always asked the Russian president about press freedoms in Russia. So I knew that one question was going to be about the NATO thing, and then I said, and of course, our press corps is likely to ask a question about press freedoms in Russia. And then I swallowed. Is he going to hit me? And Vladimir Putin is standing there, and 43 says, you got that? And Vladimir Putin says, why would I talk about press freedoms in Russia when you just fired that newsman? The president's like, what are you talking about, Vladimir?
And this is not on camera, right?
This is in the back room. He says, this is in the green room. He says, you fired that newsman. 43 says, Vladimir, are you talking about Dan Rather? And he says, that's not how it works, okay? Private company, private decision. I had nothing to do with that. And I'm telling you, as your friend, do not go out there and say that. You will embarrass yourself in front of the world, okay? Vladimir Putin says, nothing, really. And he went out, and our press corps asked the question, and sure enough, Vladimir Putin said this whole nonsense about Dan Rather. And I remember watching the reporters, and they were trying so hard not to laugh.
We were laughing at the UN.
Yeah, I bet you were laughing.
So tell us about another moment, which I know was kind of a low point overseas for you, when you're in Iraq and there's a press conference, and you're in the back of the room, and something unfolded, and you were right in the middle of it. I remember watching this thinking, oh my gosh, look at Dana.
I opened the book with a chapter, with the introduction. I call it The Black Eye of Baghdad. You'll remember when the shoes were thrown at President Bush at the press conference in December of 2008. Well, I was the only one who got hit. Of all the people in the room, I was off to the side. The president and Maliki were there to give their remarks. The guy throws his shoes. The president ducks twice. And the lead Secret Service agent was standing behind the interpreter who was next to me. And when he lunged forward to get the president, he hit the steel arm of the boom mic. And I was looking this way, but it swung around and it caught me right there. With the violence against me that I had never felt before in my life. I had never been hit. And it hurt so bad, and this Marine saw me when the president was determined to finish the press conference, which was a smart decision, right? So if you're at the UN, you're thinking, if the president turns out of there and doesn't stand strong, that looks terrible for America. So he made Maliki sit there, and I realized I got to get out of this room because my eye hurt so bad, and I wasn't really sure what was going on, but this Marine had seen what had happened, and he reaches down and he pulls me up, and we're trying to get out of the room, but now it's almost a crime scene because the Iraqis are trying to figure out who this was. And I try to get out of the room, and everyone's blocking my way. And so I said, doctor? And the guy blocking the room, he is an Iraqi security guard, and he said, oh, I am doctor. I was like, oh, my doctor? And he lets me out of the room. Anyway, the president comes and finds me, and he says, I saw you crying, but I thought it was because the guy threw a shoe at me. And I said, well, you know I adore you, but I grew up in Wyoming, and I'm a little tougher than that. But I ended up then falling asleep. I huddled on the floor of Air Force One between Baghdad and Kabul. And that wasn't very long, right? Like a 5-hour flight or something, like maybe a little longer. So I just curled up on the floor because the conference room was all set. Everybody was already sleeping. I got a blanket, and it's really cold. I remember being super cold, but I must have slept a couple of hours, and I wake up, put my blanket away in the cupboard, and I walked into the conference room of Air Force One, and Mark Thiessen, who was a speechwriter and a big hockey expert, goes, oh my gosh, did you sleep on your side? I was like, yeah. He said, all the blood pooled there. And I said, oh no, and I went into the bathroom, and I had a big black eye. The president then feels terrible for me. The White House reporters, though, the photographers agreed not to take a picture of me. They made a pact amongst themselves to say, let's leave her alone. That was really nice. And we get to Kabul, to the castle. We didn't give them much notice we were coming for security reasons. And the president says, come with me. So I walk with him as he's going to see Karzai, who, although corrupt as hell, was very charming. Can you say that on C-SPAN? Sorry.
Many people already have.
And Karzai feels so bad for me, and I said, it's okay, sir, you should see the other guy. But I ended the last 6 weeks of the administration with a black eye. How ironic.
You were saved that day by a military man. I think as we work in and around the president, we see that the U.S. military men and women are incredibly determined to keep America safe, to keep Americans safe overseas. When you're overseas in an embassy, you have American military guarding that embassy. Tell us about the day, because I know President Bush had a special place in his heart for our military. There's a great story of President Bush going to a military hospital, and you were with him. Can you tell us a little bit about the emotions of that day?
Sure, it was 2005, and Scott McClellan was the press secretary, and he asked if I could accompany the president to a visit to Bethesda Naval Hospital, which is now Walter Reed. And we were going to visit 25 wounded warriors. And I had never been on a visit like that before, so I didn't know what to expect from the families that were visiting. I wasn't sure if they would be angry, distraught. I wasn't sure, but almost, I would say, out of the 25 we saw, 24 were overjoyed to see the president. But what I write about is two scenes. One was the first person we saw. It was a Marine who had been injured in Iraq and had not opened his eyes for the 2 weeks from the explosion to when he got flown to the hospital. And his mom and dad were there, and his wife and one child, a young one, 5 or 6. And as we're walking in, the president asked the chief of naval operations, "What's the prognosis?" And he says, "Well, sir, we don't know because we haven't been able to communicate with him, but we're trying to keep him as comfortable as possible." So when the president goes in, the family's overjoyed, and everyone had to wear a mask in the ICU, and they wanted a picture with the president. So he gathers them all, and he says, "Is everybody smiling?" And then he tells the military aide to present the Purple Heart. So we all stood in silence and at attention for the moment, and the military aide reads the presentation, and at the end of it, the child pulled on the president's jacket and said, "What's a Purple Heart?" And so he got down on his knee, and he pulled her close, and he said, "Well, it's an award for your dad, because he is so brave, and he loves his country, and he loves you, and I hope you always know that, always remember that." And I was standing here, and the soldier was the Marine was in the bed over here, and I saw him open his eyes. And so did the medical staff. So they start rushing to the bed, and the CNO says, "No, I think he wants the president." And so President Bush hopped up, ran around to that side of the bed, and he cupped the Marine's face in his hands, and he's just stared right at him, and he says, "Read it again." And so we stood at attention and in silence while the Purple Heart was again presented to him, to the Marine. And at the end of that, the president touched his forehead to the Marines, and it was a moment that I tried to capture because there's a relationship between a commander-in-chief who has made a very tough decision and somebody who has volunteered to answer the call and to see it through. And that was something that I felt I should bear witness to on behalf of all of you, because what I try to show in this book is what it was like behind the scenes when there were no cameras around and how he conducted himself. The other part of that story is we then continue on, and one of the families that we saw, they're from the Caribbean, and her son was on life support. He wasn't going to make it. And she was so inconsolable, and he tried to console her at first, and that wasn't what she wanted, and then she was very upset and yelling at him and asking, why is it my child here and not yours? And he stood there and let her say whatever she needed to say, as if he wanted to absorb some of her grief, like he needed to feel it. And then the husband finally said, we're okay. The president left. Saw a couple of more wounded, and then we get into the Marine One to leave, and the way I end the chapter is to say that we get on and it's silent because it's been a very emotional morning. And the president's quiet, and he then looked up at me just as the chopper was taking off, and he said, "That mama sure was mad at me." And he said, "And I don't blame her a bit." And he looked out the window, and I saw he had like one tear that came down, but I always remember he didn't try to flick it away. And it was very silent, and then we flew back to the White House.
We're going to get to questions in just one second. Before we do, I just have one more question. For those of you who don't know Dana, she is as humble and nice and...
Don't listen to Greg Gutfeld.
She's all the things that you see, and that's the way she is in person. This book, I think, though, as I said in the very beginning, is really an uplifting book and a positive book and an encouraging book for graduates, people who are just starting their career. I would love for you to just give a quick couple of anecdotes about what you've learned in this incredibly successful life that you've had. And I know that you don't always look back and take a moment to see that you are on an incredibly popular TV show. You are a New York Times bestseller. As I told Dana today, that's going to be in our obituary. New York Times bestseller. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Give us a little sense, a couple of tips of how young people can have an amazing career.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is, especially as I do book signings, and there's some people that come through the lines, and especially that age group of like 22 to 32. This young woman came through in Long Island on Saturday night, and she said, "I felt like you were speaking directly to me." I said, "Yeah, because I went through it too." I talk about something called the quarter-life crisis. And for women, I think it's harder sometimes to turn 25 than it is to turn 40. Because all the things you thought you were going to accomplish, like, didn't quite come true yet. And then you didn't meet the guy of your dreams yet, and you're not on your path to have, the house and the kids, and you're not going to have it all by the time of 28 when you planned. And I like to remind people, today I think in particular, young people are looking for an exact roadmap. They want the GPS for their life. They want to be told, okay, where to turn, what lane to get in, at what time do they turn on their turn signals. Like that. If you give them a roadmap, they will absolutely follow it. But the theme through this book and through all of your lives as well is that no life is a straight and narrow path. And they're racked with anxiety. Millennials are nervous. And they want to achieve. They're ambitious. And so what I do in here is I break the advice part into 3 parts with very practical advice, career-type advice, and then lifetime advice. A couple of things I suggest just in the things you can do tomorrow. You might not have this problem in California. Maybe in the winter you do. But one of the things I say to them is you have to dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Dress for success is not a new phenomenon. But I use a line in there that sticks with them. And I say, you cannot wear your Ugg boots in the office. Because it makes you shuffle through life. And what I mean by that is wear your Ugg boots to commute, whatever, but when you get there, you got to look like you care, that you want this job. I also had another young woman who I was doing a little mentoring for. She had a big job interview, and the next day I said, "Did you send a thank you note?" And she said, "Oh, I sent an email." And I said, No, like a thank you note with a stamp. And she said, "Oh, don't you think that would make it look like I was trying too hard, like too formal? Like, do you want this job?" Everybody that is applying for jobs now is usually with somebody like Gen X or baby boomers. So they grew up writing thank you notes. If you want to stick out and stand out, you do. I also talk about this whole idea of networking all the time. Like, just make friends. You make friends, and then they call you in 2000 and ask you if you want to be the spokesperson on the Bush campaign. Or then they bring you over to the White House. You know that Ari Fleischer worked on Capitol Hill when I did. And I love Ari, and I always admired him so much, and I was excited to write about it in this book, and I told him he was going to be in for somebody that I knew on Capitol Hill that then I worked with in the White House, and he said, "Oh, I don't remember you."
That sounds like Ari.
Yeah, I know. Other pieces of advice in the book, I talk about civility a lot, and I use something called conversation stranger danger. That I've had a blessed life of knowing people from all walks of life. I have friends from both sides of the aisle. I have a great story in there about meeting President Obama when he was a junior senator from Illinois. And we laughed our butts off for hours. And I got home that night, my husband said, "How was your dinner?" I said, "Oh, it was great. I was at the USA Today table, and I got to sit with Barack Obama. And I got to tell you, Peter, I think he could be president in like 20 years. But trying to find a connection with people, and I also encourage them to be willing to move. I think of like North Dakota is the Wild West with Wi-Fi. They need to get out and go and see and do stuff. And what I'm hoping to tell them is that at the end of my book here, I have a conclusion of, if I take all of my advice and things that have happened and the blessings that I've had, that now I get to be on this great show, The Five, and to have time to write a book like this, I have two phrases that I coined that I think encapsulate what I was looking for and that I've achieved for the most part, and that I think others should try to find, especially these young people, that I am now have found a way to be joyously content and productively serene. And in those two ways, I think that I'm actually, hopefully, living up to my potential and giving back. One of the only things I ask of young people when I give mentoring advice is that they pass it on to the next generation. And I've been so blessed with friends and opportunities to be here in the East Room, which is amazing. And that all of you came out on a Monday night, that you're interested in this book. It really means a lot to me.
Ladies and gentlemen, the author of And the Good News Is, Dana Perino.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Dana. They have agreed to a few questions. We want to make sure we leave time for all of your books to be signed, but the first question I'm going to put on the screen because it came to us via social media this afternoon, and the question is, do you have any advice for a current broadcast journalism freshman student? This is from Kim, who is a broadcast journalism freshman student at Northwestern University. Dana.
Hi, Kim. I don't know where you are. She's there at Northwestern?
No, well, they sent it in.
Okay.
They're probably watching it on our live stream.
Journalism schools are filled all across America. And that's because a lot of people, they love the system, right? They love to tell the story. They want to get the truth. What I would recommend for journalism students today is you have to also learn something else. You have to have a specialty. So if you have a chance to do a minor in something you care about, like, let's just say biotechnology, or arts, or sports, I really think that what will set people apart is having a little bit of a specialty and something in addition to covering general news. There are a lot of new opportunities in media, but one of the things that's happening is that media gets easier to produce, and a lot of people will do it for free. So you have to think about how are you going to make a living, and you have to be a little bit practical so that you can learn how to write. That's going to be one of the most important things. In your journalism school, broadcast journalists need to learn how to write as well. When I went to graduate school in Illinois, we all failed our first writing exam. It was a real wake-up call. We ended up all doing well out of it, but writing is your most important thing. It will always be there with you, and no matter what field you end up going into, that will benefit you greatly.
Thank you, Dana. Over to your right, Steve from Yorba Linda has a question.
Hi, I'm Steve Vartanian right here in Yorba Linda. Thanks for being here. My wife Kristen and I, when we put our two boys to bed at night, Ethan and Adam, we always wonder, how bright is America's future? Because we think it's bright, but seeing it from the inside, how bright is it? What's the greatest threat to America and to our young people? Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that you think that way and that you tell your boys that because, well, I wrote a book called And the Good News Is, so I better have an optimistic viewpoint. But America, I've had a chance to travel all around the world, and many of you probably have as well. There is no place like where we were blessed to be born.
Thank you.
I think the biggest risk is an overall theme of complacency and also of being risk averse. America is exceptional, but only if we accept that responsibility. And if we are not forcefully being, and I don't mean with troops necessarily, but if we are not forcefully being the leader in the world abhors a vacuum and someone will try to fill it. And we've seen what that has been like, and the next president has a very big job in front of himself or herself, just given circumstances around the world. But complacency, I think, is our biggest risk.
Thank you, Dana. We're going to take another one. This one came via social media on video, but I'm going to ask you to stand. I want you to see what happens on the video here.
Can I see it from here?
Maybe if you
want me
just
to
step
stand?
up here. Let's. This is from New York City. Let's play this video.
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Perino. Were there any authors that inspired you, that you think about a lot, that made you want to write this book? You know, specifically, let's say male authors that gave you the ambition to achieve your dreams. Perhaps a good-looking, right-leaning libertarian author presiding in New York City. Is there somebody like that probably made you want to write this book? Feel free to respond at length. Yes, I have.
Obviously.
Does anyone know who that was?
That unemployed man was asking who inspired you to write the book.
One of the things I say about Greg Gutfeld in the book is that he is the brother I never wanted. But in all seriousness, what an amazing, talented individual. There's a lot going on up there. One of the things I love about him is that I can read his mind, not perfectly, but I can see where the jokes are going. And I start laughing before he's finished talking. And also, I don't know if you've ever seen on the show, there are times when somebody will be making we'll have a topic, and let's say I get to go first. He'll always say, I was going to say that. Or he'll say something, I'm like, that was what I had written down. So there's a joy, right? You get to work with people that you have a connection with. It's interesting that he and I sit next to each other on the 5. It wasn't because Roger Ailes had this idea that he and I were going to hit it off so well, because none of us really knew each other. Greg and I sit together on that end of the table. Guess why? We're the shortest. But he is taller than me, I will say.
Dana in the back of the room, all the way in the back. Julia from Anaheim Hills has a question.
Hi, Dana. I want to thank you for being a positive influence in all the negativity around. I appreciate that. My question is, in being with President Bush, we know that he has a special relationship with God. And how did you see that come to fruition in the behind the curtain, behind the scenes?
Thank you for the question. One of my favorite pieces of feedback from the book tour so far is from mothers who have said, thank you for being a good role model for my daughter. And not just mothers, but dads too. And there's a special story in here about my dad and I. When I was in 3rd grade, I had to read the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post before we got home from work and discuss 2 articles. And I grew up in the Lutheran church, and Greg Gutfeld thinks it's hilarious that I was in the handbell choir. But of course I was. President Bush did not shy away from his faith, and he lived it, and he was willing to talk about it. One of the things I do remember in particular behind the scenes, let's say we were going through a rope line, somebody might say, I pray about you, sir. And he would say, I know, I can feel it. And he and Mrs. Bush said that they really did feel that they were being prayed for and encouraged. And our world leaders absolutely need that kind of faithful expression from people like all of us, because what they've been asked to do is extremely difficult. All the problems of the world land on the president's desk. And you have to believe in something greater than yourself in order to manage that.
All right, we have time. We have time for 2 more. The next one is from Jeffrey in Irvine, California. We're going to put it on the screen. The question is, what was the most difficult question you were asked in the White House briefing room?
The only time I ever cried at the podium, and I didn't spill over, but I teared up, and it had nothing to do with policy or politics, because I could handle that. It was when Tony Snow called me from his exploratory surgery to tell me that his cancer had returned. And he was the press secretary before me. He inherited me as his deputy. We were very close, and not long after he arrived, he had to have this exploratory surgery and then go through another round of treatment. And he called me right before the briefing that day, and I tried to be brave on the phone, but when I went out to brief the press and say, I have an update, I remember my voice caught, and everybody in the briefing room is teary-eyed, but I'm on TV. So I pulled it together, but I think that was the hardest question, which is, is Tony coming back? And he did come back, and he did well in his treatments. He really did. And then in September of 2007, when I took over, I thought he was going to beat it. But then about 9 months later, 10 months later, he collapsed during a speaking engagement in Spokane, Washington, and never recovered. But he was in the hospital for several weeks, and Jill Snow, his wife, used to email me and say, Tony watched the briefing today, and he was so mad at the reporters, he threw his ice bucket on the floor in solidarity, with me. He was the one who, on his last day at the White House, came to me and said, how are you feeling about things? And I said, not very good, because how am I supposed to replace you? He was such a giant in the briefing room, and everybody in Washington loved Tony Snow, not a single Tony. And I just didn't know how I was supposed to replace him, and I could just imagine the ridicule and criticism that was coming my way. But he made me stand up. And again, he was 6'5", and I was 5 feet tall. Maybe still, hopefully. And he said, you're better at this than you think you are. So I've had all these men in my life, from my grandfather to the president, Tony Snow, my husband, even Senator John Warner at the end of the book, who all come together to try to help me achieve something. So that's why I never understood the Republican war on women. I guess I kind of know in theory where they're coming from, but I just never experienced that. And so the hardest briefing was the one about Tony Snow. One story I reveal in the book, that even Ed Henry, who then was at CNN and now he's at Fox News, even he didn't know this. In July of 2008, we went to the G8 in Japan. It was a disaster. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. It was the worst G8. And we were fogged in for 3 days. Nobody could see anything. And my theory is anytime a president goes on a foreign trip, something happens back home that consumes all of your attention. Well, that was the case then. I get back. I'm not a good traveler to Asia. I have a hard time recovering. So I told my husband, I just need 1 night of sleep, and then I can get up and do it all over again. Well, the phone rings at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I pick up my BlackBerry, and it's Ed Henry. I'm like, oh, grief. What does he want? So I answer the phone, and Ed's a sentimental guy, and I hear his voice, and he says, Dana, I'm so sorry to call you this early, but I need a comment. And every bit of my antenna went off, and I said, Ed, I'm going to call you right back, because I had a feeling that Tony had passed, but I didn't want to give CNN the satisfaction of telling the world that they were the ones that informed the White House. So when I hung up and I scrolled through my messages, and at 3:40 in the morning, Jill had sent me an email that let me know that Tony had died.
Great, thank you, Dana. We're going to close with a question from a fan in New York City.
There is one?
It's from Jasper. It's got Jasper's picture. He sent this in and demanded that we ask you. Jasper asked, do you miss me?
Jasper is the result of Greta Van Susteren, who insisted Peter and I get another dog after Henry passed. And one night on Red Eye, Greg Gutfeld said that there was this actress in Hollywood, and she was really mad because the paparazzi kept taking pictures of her dog. And he says, Dana, you're a monster who's been known to fly into a rage whenever someone takes a picture of your dog. And I said, oh no, I want everyone to be able to share my dog. He can be America's dog. And there he is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick Rennell and Dana Perino. The book is, and the good news is, and all of you who have the book, go out to the lobby and they'll sign. Those of you who don't, they're for sale in our museum store. Thank you for coming to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. God bless you and God bless America.